Hello everyone, welcome back to Run the NBA, and today I want to talk about one of the most fascinating young players in the NBA, and that is Kevin Porter Jr. Kevin Porter Jr. is someone who's been controversial throughout his young NBA career. There's a reason why he was traded for a second round pick to the Houston Rockets, and that was not due to the lack of his ability on the court, but simply due to that controversy. Now, the controversy as far as how good he can actually be on the court is also a thing now, because he is one of the most overrated or underrated players and prospects in the NBA, depending on who you talk to. This is someone who played with Houston last year for 26 games after the trade from the Cleveland Cavaliers, had some very promising moments, had, of course, that absolutely remarkable 50-point game that everyone talks about and that lots of people will overrate him on. But then you get the other side of the spectrum that will severely underrate him and discredit that game completely, which it is one game, so fair enough. But will just not evaluate him anywhere near to the level of prospect that he is. And so, in today's video, I want to talk about Kevin Porter Jr. I want to evaluate his play last season, what he projects to do and what role he projects to play for the Houston Rockets this upcoming season, and give my evaluation of how good Kevin Porter Jr. actually is and what his upside is in the NBA as far as I'm concerned. With that being said, if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, be sure to leave a like down below and subscribe to the channel if you are new. And let's go ahead and talk about Kevin Porter Jr.'s last season with the Houston Rockets. As mentioned previously, of course, Kevin Porter Jr. was traded from the Cleveland Cavaliers to the Houston Rockets in January for a 2024 second round pick, and played from the Houston Rockets from there in 26 games, starting in 23 of those, and was fairly good. It was definitely not the type of player that you would expect to get for a second round pick, but some of the off-the-court controversy is what led to that happening. As far as his stat line last year, he averaged 16.6 points per game, 6.3 assists, along with 0.7 steals and 3.8 rebounds a night. This is someone who at 6'4" is a fairly tall guard. And for me, where we're going to start is his role with the Houston Rockets next year. And that for me is that of the starting point guard long term for the Houston Rockets. Because next year, is he going to be that guy? Probably not, because someone called John Wall is still there. And that's just the way it is. But John Wall is not a long-term piece of the Houston Rockets, obviously. He does not fit the timeline whatsoever. And so that may mean for the time being that Kevin Porter Jr. plays at the 2 and Jalen Green plays at the 3. But long-term, I project Kevin Porter Jr. as the point guard and Jalen Green as the 2. I think Jalen Green defensively will fit better at the 2. I don't think he quite has that size that you would ideally like for the 3, but that you could definitely argue. But as far as Kevin Porter Jr. goes, his playmaking is why I say he should be a point guard. This is someone who, for the first time really in his career, of course it is a young career, but nonetheless, the first time in his career last year where he was really a primary ball handler and someone who was essentially going to do a lot of creating his own shot and creating for others. And then in that first season that he had to do so, on a Houston Rockets team that wasn't good, and so, of course, his assist numbers were not boosted by guys hitting a ton of shots around him, he averaged 6.3 assists per night. And there's a reason why he had that 50-point performance with the assist numbers he had, because he is a very good playmaker. Sure, he is a scorer. He projects to be a decent three-point shooter, but he is an extremely good playmaker. And sure, you don't have to be a point guard to be a very good playmaker. We've seen lots of guys over the last few years at the shooting guard spot or at forward spots that are good playmakers. But the reason I say that he should be the future point guard for this team alongside with his playmaking ability is there isn't a point guard on this team for the future. It's John Wall and it's DJ Augustine. And they don't have any young talent at the point guard position. And so I think Kevin Porter Jr. is that guy, and they can have a very long, lengthy, tall backcourt in Jalen Green and Kevin Porter Jr. That's my thoughts as of right now. So I think that's the best spot for him. I think he is more of a point guard than a shooting guard, He is a good shooter, and he is a good shot creator, but efficiency, at least at this point in time in his career, is definitely a concern, and he's never been an amazing three-point shooter throughout his NBA career. He shot 33.5% year one, 31% year two. Year two, of course, those numbers are lower because his role was much bigger in Houston. He was taking much more shots, but in the smaller role off of the bench in Cleveland in year one, he wasn't overly efficient either. And sure, he'll probably improve from that mark and become a better three-point shooter. But for me, a shooting guard prototypically is just someone who's going to go out and get you buckets. That sounds like Jalen Green. Your point guard is going to be someone who's a bit more of a playmaker. That's Kevin Porter Jr. So that's where I project him long-term for the Houston Rockets. It's quite likely he'll play a lot of minutes at the 2 next year, but once John Wall and his time with the Houston Rockets is done, I would expect, unless a point guard prospect is taken between now and then, for Kevin Porter Jr. to be the future point guard of the Houston Rockets. But now let's talk about how good can Kevin Porter Jr. actually be. Where do I stand on how his evaluation is? Because there's some people that just think he's going to be a decent 6th man, or he's completely overrated and is just going to be an okay bench piece. But then you also get people that think that Kevin Porter Jr. is a future all-star. There is a wide range on Kevin Porter Jr. Some of it is to do with his off-the-court issues and that being in the way, and that ended up being his downfall. And some people put a ton of stock into that absolute explosion of a game that he had last year and feel that he is going to be one of the best players in the league. Personally, I think Kevin Porter Jr. has the potential to be a very good guard in the NBA. He already showed that last year that he has the potential to be that. I wouldn't consider him one of the top point guards in the league right now by any stretch. I wouldn't even put him near a top 20 list personally. Now, if you want to say he's a shooting guard, he's still not getting on my top 20 shooting guard list. I'm just classifying as a point guard for the sake of argument, given that's where I think his long-term role is. So that's just the assumption we're making for the video. If you think he's somewhere else, that's fair. Let's have that discussion in the comment section, but I'm assuming point guard for the video. But long-term, I think he definitely can move up in those point guard lists, because I think he has the potential to be a very good playmaker, considering the fact he was already such a good playmaker last year for someone that didn't really have that type of opportunities earlier on in his NBA career. I think this is someone who has the upside to be one of the best playmaking point guards in the NBA. The scoring part, I think, still needs improvement. Of course, as I mentioned, this is someone who averaged over 16 points per game last year. But yes, I am saying the scoring needs improvement, because he put up good numbers last year on a team where he could shoot the ball a lot on poor efficiency. His three-point shooting efficiency specifically is something that I want to see more improvement from for Kevin Porter Jr. I think he can get there. I think he will get more efficient on offense. I think he will continue to improve his shot, but he definitely does need to improve that efficiency significantly before I include him amongst the best guards in the NBA. He definitely has the potential to be solid on the defensive end as well, although the point guard spot might not be quite ideal for him on that defensive end because of lateral quicks, but I think he does have the athleticism to do it and adjust to be solid at that spot on the defensive end, and he most certainly has the length and the size to be able to guard at that spot, and in fact have it be an advantage for him on the defensive end. And I think that'll also allow him to be able to develop into a solid finisher at the rim for his position. With that being said, I don't think, for me personally, that Kevin Porter Jr. is going to be a future all-star. For me, he projects as someone that is all-star caliber or slightly below, but I don't necessarily see Kevin Porter Jr. as someone who's going to be making all-star games. If he makes one and is an all-star fringe guy, then I could see that potentially, but I don't see Kevin Porter Jr. being a perennial all-star, a multi-time all-star. I think he's going to be a solid playmaking point guard. You could argue at some point in times in his career that he'll be a top 10 point guard in the NBA, but I don't think he's going to be at that level. If he's on one of the best winning teams in the NBA, then sure, that can definitely influence his chances. But personally speaking, I think Kevin Porter Jr. is going to be a borderline all-star point guard, which is no knock on Kevin Porter Jr., because that's a pretty darn good role. And that's a lot of money that he's going to make throughout his NBA career. But I think his offense definitely needs a lot of improvement for him to be considered amongst that class, most specifically in the shooting efficiency. And I think he can continue to increase his playmaking ability as well to become one of the best playmaking guards in the NBA. With that being said, that is my thoughts and evaluation on Kevin Porter Jr. after his first 2 years in the NBA. But be sure to let me know down in the comment section what you guys think and feel about Kevin Porter Jr. moving into next year and beyond that in the NBA. As for me personally, he is one of the hardest players to evaluate and project where his future lies in the NBA. So if I'm wrong on this video in a couple of years and he is projects to be a multi-time All-Star, I will happily be wrong, because I will always happily be wrong if people can surpass expectations in a positive way. And so I hope Kevin Porter can continue to do that and can have a good positive year with the Houston Rockets. With that being said, if you guys did enjoy the video, be sure to leave a like down below and subscribe to the channel if you are new. And if you want to hear my thoughts on other things NBA offseason, then be sure to click the box on the right hand side of the screen. And if you want to hear my video and thoughts on Şengün, one of the many good picks by the Houston Rockets in this year's first round, then be sure to click the box on the left hand side of the screen. With that being said, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.